This video will be for Chapter 2 for PSY 230 Personality Theory, covering Carl Jung and analytical psychology. So Carl Jung, and we've just come off the chapter on Sigmund Freud. Carl Jung, as I noted on the D2L page, my introductory comments, Jung is a fascinating figure in the history of personality theory and in the history of psychology generally. He and Freud had a very intense relationship, both professionally and personally. And we'll get to some of the issues that are related there. But you should understand from the start that Jung was definitely one of the people who was involved in the early stages of Freud's work and in later conversations about Freudian theory generally. So let's get to know Carl Jung. Jung was born in Switzerland. His father was a pastor, so there was quite a bit of a religious backdrop to his life and upbringing. He had this tendency toward fairly intense metaphysical experiences. He described them as deeply spiritual experiences, and these were experiences that happened to him as a child and an adolescent. Some have speculated that what Jung was experiencing was early symptoms, perhaps, of bipolar disorder, but we really have no way to respond to those speculations. When you're dealing with a person who is no longer living and all you have to go on are documents or stories that other people have told, it's really risky to make those kinds of guesses and speculations. For our purposes, all you need to know is that Jung had simultaneously a very scientific side and a very spiritually driven side. He was always seen as a seeker. He wanted to know the meaning of things. And given his background growing up in a religious home, it's not surprising that at least part of his nature was seeking the spiritual as a part of his experiences. Like Freud, he studied medicine, and given the time when he was studying medicine, there was a lot of this conversation in that part of Europe about psychiatry and the emerging study of what were called at the time psychic phenomenon, which doesn't necessarily mean what you might be thinking, like ESP and things like that, but more globally experiences of the mind, and that may include what we would now call psychic phenomenon, but recognize that the term was much more broad at the time when Jung was studying. He earned his medical degree. He interned at a prestigious hospital. So what that tells you is, as a medical doctor, he was a high performer and he was very valued. That's another commonality he has with Sigmund Freud. He lectured at the University of Zurich, and that's when he really started to dig into Freud's work. So Freud was, in many ways, already becoming a mentor to Jung as he was studying medicine and then as he was lecturing in medicine. Freud and Jung, over time, after Jung was reading his work while he was working at the University of Zurich, he wrote letters. The letters between Freud and Jung are epic. If you ever really get into the history of psychology, reading the Freud-Jung letters is fascinating. So they wrote a lot of long letters to each other. They also met frequently. Originally their relationship was mentor and mentee, but they developed this intense friendship where eventually their differences in beliefs, their differences in style and ethos really broke them apart, and neither man was really the same after that. They both deeply mourned the loss of their friendship, given that they could not reconcile their differences theoretically. After breaking with Freud, he continued to develop his own ideas. He wrote prolifically. He spoke often in public spheres. He took on students of his own and worked as a mentor to those individuals. He had some health problems over the years. He had a near-death experience after a heart attack in the 1940s while he was lecturing. And that near-death experience sort of was a capstone for him for thinking about some of the metaphysical and spiritualist ideas that inform his theory. He lived a long life. He died in 1961. His work has fingers in many, many different areas of study. He was influential and influenced by anthropology. He was in some ways influential and influenced by the study of history and the study of religion. So beyond psychology and psychiatry, he has had a role to play in many other areas of study. So Jung and Freud, what went wrong? And I love this historical photo. It kind of shows a time period when Jung and Freud were still in communication and involved with one another. I love this image of them with their arms intertwined, drinking a toast. They were close. They understood one another, but they were fierce competitors in addition to having this mentor-mentee relationship. Freud had a tendency with his students to be kind of all or none. You're either with me or you're against me. He didn't take criticism particularly well, and he wasn't necessarily open to modifying his ideas, particularly when the requests for changes or openness to changes and modification was coming from people he was doing analysis with. So one of the things you need to understand with Freud, in order to become a psychoanalyst at that point in time, and this is still true in some institutions today where psychoanalysis is being actively taught, you have to submit to analysis. You have to be analyzed before you can do analysis with other people. So, in many ways, these interactions between Freud and his students, people like Jung, were incredibly intense and complicated because he knew and understood his students in a very deeply personal way. So when they had disputes, when they had disagreements, it became personalized. And, as Freud would put it, there was quite a bit of transference occurring. So the primary issues between Jung and Freud, Freud insisted that most of what was going on in human experience was connected somehow to sexual trauma or issues of conflict associated with sexuality. So not necessarily sexual assault or sexual abuse, but the more broad experiences that may be traumatic or difficult during development that are associated with sexuality. Jung didn't accept that. He didn't believe that that was the only source of energy driving personality development and functioning. He thought that there was more under the hood than just sexuality and trauma associated with it. For Freud's part, he was very dismissive of Jung's interest in religion, his interest in the spiritual, his interest in images and iconography, and also occult philosophies. Freud was very clear. He felt that religion was a gigantic defense mechanism, and anything that even smacked of a spiritual system of belief, he believed was, again, just one great big complicated, socially acceptable defense mechanism to make you feel like you have more control over your experiences than you do. So when Jung talked about these emerging ideas like the collective unconscious and the idea that there are mythological images and spiritual elements to us that are transmitted across generations, Freud was like, no, hard no, that is not, no. So they really couldn't get beyond that. Like I said before, there's like a part of Jung that's very scientific and very orderly, and we'll get to that in a bit, where he talks about the personality typology. But there's also this side of Jung that is very expansive and spiritually driven. It's like a complicated layer of two very different approaches to personality. One is very trait-based, and the other is very Eastern in some ways. So students often find Jung challenging because of that. Freud was just completely, he felt that religion was delusional, essentially. And anything like it, like spiritualism, occult phenomenon, alchemy, these things were essentially spiritualistic, and therefore they were fundamentally delusional. Another difference between them, Jung considered the libido to not just be sexual in nature, and he didn't even think sex was necessarily the primary source of energy. So instead of really kind of attaching sexuality to libido, he redefined libido as broader, a general repository of psychic energy. And then finally, while Jung liked many things about the Freudian approach, especially his descriptions of various patterns of psychopathology, he really he wasn't satisfied with the limits of just saying there's not a lot that happens after early childhood in terms of psychological development. He felt that that was far too limiting. As we'll discover later in the chapter, Jung felt that, a lot of the stuff that Freud described, defenses and lingering issues associated with fixations in childhood or problems in development in childhood, he felt that, generally speaking, people deal with that stuff. They find ways around it, they manage, and they rarely end up in a psychologist or a psychiatrist's practice because they haven't been able to cope with those issues. He felt the bigger challenge of human development came after childhood, after adolescence, when you have a young adult, an adult, even an older person who is trying desperately to find meaning in their existence, to find the bigger picture for themselves. So in some ways, Jung foreshadowed changes that came later in terms of opening the door in psychology to humanistic and existential approaches, as well as to allowing for reinterpretations of various Eastern traditions to be brought into the world of personality theorizing. Now, some broad influences for Jung. One of the things that really attracted me to Jung when I was studying personality in graduate school was just how broad his influences were. To be honest, there were some things when I was a college student, when I was an early grad student, that I was just into that I thought were, cool and hip. Anyway, he did read Goethe, he did read Nietzsche, and was influenced particularly by the story of Faust, where he was using just this really powerful imagery of Faust, of Goethe's Faust, to kind of give him these ideas about duality. And what we'll see later in Jungian theory is it's all about duality. It's all about opposing opposite forces that have to be brought into dynamic balance. So you've got the powers of good and evil. You have the struggle between these forces, like good versus evil, how that struggle really pushes people in the direction of growth and greater insight. He also looked at Nietzsche. You saw Freud and Nietzsche both as powerful shapers of Western culture. Nietzsche with respect to power, and Freud with respect to sexuality, the eros. And he felt that these perspectives, both perspectives, were informative, incomplete, but informative. Especially, and we'll connect some of these dots in the other two parts of the presentation, but on the power side, we have a need for control, but we also have a need to be controlled. We have needs for love, and we also have needs for separation. And Jung was all about dualities and how the human experience really demands that we find a way to balance these competing forces within ourselves. Jung was also influenced by Gnosticism and alchemy. Gnosticism, and I'm not going to get into the weeds of what Gnosticism is, but it's a mystical branch or a spiritualist branch of Christianity, which has some what to me feel like some tendencies that ring kind of a Buddhist bell for me. They have some similar kind of ideas and notions about the mind, not so much the details, but about how the mind and consciousness work. So the mysticism of Gnosticism was attractive to Jung, as particularly the symbols that were involved in the writing. He was always very fond of reading works, whether it was literature or religious writings. He kind of gravitated towards the writing that had symbols, that was heavy in symbolism. And the symbolism, he believed, was kind of the way our unconscious is organized. When we get into talking about the collective unconscious, that will become more obvious to you. In the alchemical literature, and my first introduction to alchemy was this idea that somebody could turn whatever nonsense they had in their laboratory into gold. Well, it's more than that. The alchemical literature was about transformation, and the short version is trying to somehow turn base metals into gold, but that was more metaphorical, where you're talking about the capacity for people to move from a base state into something more remarkable. And that alchemical kind of description of transformation and growth kind of laid out the framework for Jung's later thinking about what he called individuation. And then Jung also was influenced by various forms of Eastern spirituality. His interest in mythology and symbolism tapped into especially a lot of art that he saw in various Eastern traditions. He was particularly interested in the cultures of India and Pakistan, and the artwork connected to it. He was also interested in these sort of symbolic images that he found kind of were carrying over from Eastern thought into Western European traditions. He tended to gravitate toward the way various Eastern schools of thought, like Buddhism, Hinduism, for example, described spiritual growth. The idea of dynamic balance, the idea of dualities and suffering are particularly, they show up in Jung's later thinking about the process of individuation, but also the process of therapy. He was particularly fond of the Mandala image. And you've probably seen, if you've gone to a big church with a rose window, that's a mandala. You've seen probably coloring books, adult coloring books, they're mandala books, where we're trying to, through our exploration of images like spoked wheels, it's designed to create peace and meditative state. Jung liked mandalas because they have arms and this idea of dual sides to every spoke, and the need to balance them was something central to his theorizing. He was probably, if you look at all the Eastern traditions that shaped him, India and Indian thought tended to have the strongest impact for him. Now, beyond all of, you remember how I said there's kind of like, two tracks for Jung. You've got the track where he's really parsing out for you character types and traits. So there's this one version of Jung that is very much a trait psychologist, but then there's this whole other side that is about the inner workings of the collective unconscious and growth and development beyond childhood and adolescence. So with the personality typology piece, you probably have been exposed to Jung's ideas without knowing they were Jung's ideas. Most of us have filled out a questionnaire at some point that gives us a description of ourselves in terms of introversion and extroversion, in terms of thinking and feeling, and so on. I remember in the early days of Facebook, when it was still, relatively cheerful there would be these little apps that would pop up and say, what's your personality type? And you'd fill out a few items and it would give you your INFJ or whatever, your profile. Well, all of that, the introversion, extroversion piece and the other elements connected to it are Jungian. So I'm sure that you've filled out a questionnaire like this at some point in time. Now, the way the system works for Jung, there are two social orientations. So this is the orientation of the individual within the social world. And those two orientations are introversion and extroversion. Now, a lot of times we conflate introversion with shyness and extroversion with outgoingness. That's a little too simplistic in terms of the way Jung thought about them. So we're going to need to be a little more nuanced in the way we think about extroversion and introversion in the Jungian model. He then added, in addition to introversion and extroversion as basic orientations to the social world, one with greater engagement in that social sphere and the other with less engagement in that social sphere. Then he also added what he called functional modes, which are more behavioral, but they're also more cognitive. So it's about how do you like taking in information? How do you like making decisions are a part of it. Now, students after Jung, so people who were trained in the Jungian psychology tradition, have refined the model and added another functional mode. But in Jung's own voice, there were two basic orientations to the social world, and there were then two sets or four functional modes for experiencing the world, bringing in information and making decisions. So the orientation, the orientations, first introversion. The emphasis, and again, introversion does not equal shyness. Even though in popular culture there's a tendency for us to assume that introverts are awkward, that they're shy, that they don't like other people. That's not really the case. Introversion for Jung is individuals who have a tendency to be more focused on their own thinking and thinking about the social world in terms of how it shapes them, how it affects them in terms of how it can make them feel, how it can make them change in their thinking, and so on. Extroversion, the focus is on the external world. So extroverts tend to think about what they do to the world, how they act on the world. So introverts and extroverts could both be characterologically shy. but their orientation to the world is quite different. Introverts, it's really about how is the world impacting them in terms of their thinking and their feeling and their behaviors. At the extrovert, the focus is on how am I impacting the world that surrounds me? How are my feelings, my thoughts, my actions, how are they impactful going outward into the world? For the introvert, how are the things going on in the world impacting my thinking, feeling, and acting? Now, most people are not purely either introverted or extroverted. There may be a general trend in one direction or the other. Some people are quite balanced between the two, and for a lot of people, it's situational. But for Jung, remember how I said he's really into dualistic constructs? Introversion and extroversion, he saw them as two ends of a dimension. And people kind of move the slider from one end to the other. It's not necessary that you assume that a person will always stay in their primary orientation. Developmentally, they may change, although he did argue that typically people are going to stick with their broad orientation. And the research kind of bears that out. So just to pull some things together, no one is a pure introvert or a pure extrovert. That is extraordinarily unlikely. People do tend to prefer one pole over the other. And they may engage in behaviors that are more consistent with one because their situation demands it, but their primary orientation is the other. So for example, I tend to score high on introversion on these scales, but in my job I have to be quite extroverted, so I usually have to take a nap when I get home after teaching, for example. He argued, and this reinforces that idea of duality. He argued that you can't simultaneously be functioning in a way that is consistent with one and the other. You can't do them concurrently. So the idea is that you can call upon both when it is necessary. So Jung rather felt that at our healthiest, the ideal means that you have identified within yourself both introverted and extroverted possibilities, potentials. In your life, you probably have gravitated towards one or the other more often. But the healthiest person is the person who's like, okay, I tend to gravitate this way, but there are situations where I need to tap into my other potential in order to be successful. So the person who leans toward the extroverted may find it difficult to sit in quiet and contemplate and work on things alone. The person, in order to be successful, their life may demand that they learn how to embrace some hidden, sometimes suppressed, introverted orientation and use that when it is useful. Same for a primarily introverted person. So for myself, for example, I do tend toward introversion, but to be successful in my work, I need to be able to be a good communicator. I need to be able to engage other people and do some of that face-to-face stuff that I would rather not do, but because I have the capacity, I tap into it and I can use it as needed. Now the functions, the four functional modes, these functions, they tend to be what you see layered on top of the basic orientations. So usually when you're doing one of these questionnaires, you're going to get the big I or O, or I or E, sorry, and then you have some additional scores that are going to add to that some more nuance. So functions are going to be experienced in either in a way that's representative of either introverted or extroverted orientation. The type of function is going to then translate into what Jung described as relative strengths and weaknesses. and in some ways, the types of things people prefer to do with their time. So the logic here is that you have these two dimensions, two sets of functional modes. One of them is going to be typically dominant. And Jung used the term superior function to describe this, so a dominant set of traits. Some of the more sophisticated questionnaires that you fill out to assess your personality will identify for you a superior or dominant function. The remaining functions are going to be less important, less formative of your thoughts, feelings, and actions. So within your primary orientation, extroversion or introversion, you'll also have a dominant function that pushes your behavior in certain directions. One of the other three is going to be like the second in line. And then when you go farther and farther down the list of functions, eventually one of the other three remaining functions is going to be very deep in the unconscious, and it's going to be much less developed. Jung referred to this as an inferior function. So you've got the superior function that tends to be dominant in terms of shaping overt behaviors and then also cognitions and emotions. One of the functions is going to be buried pretty deep. For Jung, again, just like with introversion and extroversion, he argued that for people to live their best life, they have to recognize that they have hidden potentials, that they lean in directions that are most comfortable, but there are times that they can tap into these less developed, more unconscious functions that can be very useful to them and make them more well-rounded. So the first of these dimensions that Jung identified was the thinking-feeling dimension. And this is about how do we make decisions? How do we make judgments and decisions? So some people tend to prefer organizing, classifying, defining some kind of objective truth to make their decisions. That's the thinking function. Your authors give you these questions, and I think they're really helpful for making sense of what Jung meant. So what does this mean? So you're faced with a decision, and if you're a thinker, you're going to classify things, you're going to organize them, you're going to try and come up with the right answer to the question, what does this mean? The feeling person is really going on gut. And do they like it or do they not like it? Is it good? Is it bad? And that's really an assessment of value. So to give you a concrete example, if you are a person, and both would take, regardless of which functional mode, thinking or feeling, here for making decisions, there's going to be either an introverted or an extroverted form for it. But, you know, if you have to decide, where am I going to go to eat tonight? The thinker is going to classify, organize, ask what's the right place to go to eat based on who I am. The feeling person may make value judgments. Is it good food? Is it bad food? You know, or here's another one that one of my friends used to use as an example. How do people decide what wine to buy? The thinker, am I on a budget? I'm going to go with the wine that's on sale, that's in my price range, and I'm going to take the best quality within that frame, and then I'm going to buy it. The feeling person is going to be, it has to be a high quality wine. It has to be a wine that I like, that is good, that is valued by other people, right? So there's differences in orientation to decision making for those two functional modes. Now the other dimension is sensation and intuition, and these are ways that you get information. So distinct from making decisions and judgments, here just how do you like pulling information in? So for some people, they prefer direct experience. They don't want to read other people's perceptions. They don't want to imagine. They want to sense it directly. These are people who are really experiential. And, their answer to questions about the world is, what am I directly perceiving? So sensors are people who prefer to be in it, experiencing it for themselves. They don't want to read about somebody skydiving. They want to skydive so that they know what it feels like. The intuitor, it is going to be thinking about possibilities. So in terms of what they want to do to gather information, they want to spend some time really kind of thinking about possible perceptions that they might have. What are the future outcomes that are possible? What kind of unconscious processes might be involved? So that they're saying what might happen. The example that one of my professors in grad school gave was, okay, so you have a sensor and an intuitor. How are they going to think about, say, maybe the possibility of taking a psychedelic drug differently? The sensor is like, give me the drug and I'll let you know. And they'll say, what am I perceiving? And then they'll tell you. So they prefer to just take the drug. The intuitor wants to spend some time thinking about what are the attributes of the drug, what are other people's experiences of the drug like, how would this fit into my future decision making, or maybe how I might study it, how would it relate to my experiences of myself. So the intuitor is more, what might happen if I took the drug? The sensor is like, give me the drug, right? Now, for Jung, again, he is all about dynamic balance. You think about these dimensions. Thinking and feeling are two ends of a teeter-totter. For Jung, the goal is to have both people in the air simultaneously on the teeter-totter. You want to equate your thinking and feeling. You want to equate your sensing and intuition. If you drop any side and too strongly lean in one direction, like let's say thinking is your primary, your superior function, and you're burying sensation, you're burying sensing as your inferior function. Think of what you might miss in terms of experiential engagement. So for Jung, a well-rounded, healthy person is able to tap into and bring out their less strong functional modes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, and this will conclude this section of the lecture, I mentioned earlier that people who came after Jung but who worked with his model added some additional, they added an additional layer. So they have outwardly versus inwardly focused. That's the EI, the introversion, extroversion. That's the orientation. So that's what you're going to get first in terms of how you're evaluated on, say, an instrument. Then the question becomes, how do you prefer to take in information? So sensors focusing on how the reality of how things are, looking at concrete details, looking at practical applications, looking at things literally. For intuition, imagining possibilities, imagining the big picture, enjoying ideas for their own sake, and so on. Then how do you prefer to make decisions, thinking and feeling? Making decisions as a thinker is a bit less, it's more impersonal, it's more logical. Trying to find flaws in an argument may be a tendency for that person, whereas feelers tend to be making personal judgments of right and wrong. Valuing things like harmony and forgiveness is pretty common among these individuals, and a tendency toward pleasing others might come into this as well. But then they add a layer in most of these measures, and this is one that Jung didn't identify, but it ties back to eventually introversion, extroversion. So this fourth layer is, how do you prefer to live your life? Are you a person who really prefers it when things get settled, when things are done? And these are people who are described as preferring judgment. Rules, deadlines, they're things that need to be respected. There's step by step, and you need to take the steps. You like plans, you like organization in the way you live your life. These are checklist people. I tend to be one of these people. It's how I cope with anxieties. I like rules, I like deadlines, I like to have step-by-step instructions, I like plans. It's why my syllabi are so obnoxiously obsessive. And then there are perceiving people. These are people who like things to be open-ended. They like things to be flexible. They like to improvise. They like to be spontaneous. One of my best friends in the world, when we get together, she prefers all of this spontaneity of being a perceiver. I prefer order. I like to have a plan. It makes me super anxious when we deviate from the plan. So if I were to label myself, for example, my general orientation tends to be introversion. I tend to be an intuitor. I also tend to be a thinker, and I tend to be a judger. So I tend to be INTJ. So, you've filled out questionnaires like this. The Myers-Briggs is one of those that came out of the Jungian tradition, but then expanded on it and did some clarification. These patterns, they tend to be pretty robust. When people in adolescence and young adulthood fill out a Myers-Briggs, the findings tend to hold pretty well across the lifespan, with little modifications here and there over time, depending on how people's lives unfold. But they tend to be fairly robust in how people think about themselves. So that concludes part 1 of chapter 2, Carl Jung.